This is Mark, and this is the bullet that was able to reduce the number of perfect surgeries I had. He took this shot after being caught by his wife with another woman. The bullet entered the left gluteal region, the upper outer quadrant of the buttock. Mark arrived on a stretcher with 2 large bore IVs already in place, and a compression dressing on his left buttock soaked completely through with blood. His pressure was holding, 94/60. Not good, but not in free fall. Heart rate was 118. He was awake, talking, and alternating between genuine pain and what I can only describe as profound social mortification. The entry wound was clean, small, upper outer gluteal region, just below the iliac crest. No exit wound. The bullet was still inside. We stabilized him, pushed fluids, and I ran a quick trauma assessment. Abdomen was soft. Good. No peritoneal involvement. Pelvis was stable. Sensation present in both legs. He could wiggle the toes on both feet. That last part mattered more than anything else in that moment. We had him in CT 8 minutes after arrival, and when those images came up on the screen, the room got very quiet. The bullet hadn't stayed where entry wounds typically suggest. It had deflected off the posterior surface of the ilium, the back of the hip bone, and traveled medially and downward. It was sitting approximately 2 centimeters from the sciatic nerve. 2 centimeters, the width of your index finger, and right next to it, the inferior gluteal artery, with what appeared to be a partial laceration. That's where the bleeding was coming from. That's why the pressure wasn't where we needed it. We had 2 problems, and they were sitting right next to each other. Let me explain why this was such a difficult situation. Because the anatomy here is everything. The sciatic nerve is the largest nerve in the human body. It runs from the lumbar spine, through the deep gluteal muscles, down the back of the thigh, and branches into everything that controls movement and sensation below the knee. If you damage it, truly cut, or crush it beyond recovery, the consequences are permanent. Foot drop, loss of sensation, a walking impairment that no amount of physical therapy will fully correct. The inferior gluteal artery supplies the gluteal muscles and anastomosis, with several other vessels in the region. A partial laceration, which is what we were looking at, can create a temporary tamponade effect. The surrounding tissue builds up pressure that slows the bleeding. But it won't hold. At some point, that tamponade fails, the bleeding accelerates, and you have a catastrophic hemorrhage in a closed space. Here was our problem. To properly repair the arterial laceration, I needed to approach from a specific angle that gave me direct visualization and control. That approach put my instruments millimeters from the sciatic nerve, in a field already bloody, already distorted by hematoma, with a metal fragment sitting in the middle of everything. One wrong move repairing the artery could damage the nerve. But if I tried to protect the nerve first, if I spent time carefully dissecting through the hematoma before touching the artery, Mark could bleed out on the table. I had about 30 seconds to make a decision. I want to be honest about what that moment actually feels like. People imagine surgeons as purely analytical under pressure. That's not entirely true. You run the math. Arterial hemorrhage kills in minutes. Nerve damage is devastating, but survivable. The math says, control the bleeding first, but the math isn't clean. Nerve damage isn't just survivable, it's permanent. Mark was 42 years old, a man whose livelihood depended on being physically capable, and I was about to work 2 centimeters from the nerve that controlled his ability to walk, in a bloody field, under time pressure. I made the call. We went for the artery first. My resident was on the other side of the table. I told her, stay focused on the vessel, don't let your instruments drift, and call out immediately if the monitoring changes. We had neuromonitoring running, electrodes measuring the electrical activity of the sciatic nerve in real time. If the signal dropped, we'd know we were causing damage. We controlled the artery in 11 minutes. The laceration was repaired. The bleeding stopped. Mark's pressure came up. Heart rate came down. The nerve monitor hadn't changed, but we still had the bullet to deal with. And that's when everything got complicated. The standard protocol for a bullet fragment near a major nerve is conservative. If it's not causing active damage, if it's not infected, if it's not migrating, you leave it. The risk of extraction often outweighs the risk of leaving it in place. Metal fragments can sit in the human body for decades without causing problems. I was prepared to close, leave the fragment, and call the case a success. Then my resident said something that stopped me cold. The signal dropped. I looked at the monitor. She was right. The electrical activity of the sciatic nerve had decreased, not dramatically, not to zero, but measurably, undeniably lower than it had been 60 seconds before. The fragment hadn't moved. We hadn't touched it. But something was happening to that nerve. I examined the field more carefully. The hematoma, the large collection of blood that had formed along the bullet's tract, was still there. We had focused on the artery and hadn't fully addressed it. And as the arterial repair held and pressure in the tissue began to normalize, that hematoma was doing something we hadn't anticipated. It was expanding slightly, redistributing, and it was pressing directly against the sciatic nerve. That changed everything. A severed nerve is a lost nerve, at least in the short term, and often permanently. But a compressed nerve is an entirely different story. Compressed nerves can recover. If you relieve the pressure in time, before the compression causes irreversible ischemic damage to the nerve fibers themselves, function can return. The question was whether we were in time, and whether attempting to evacuate the hematoma, which meant working directly in the tissue immediately surrounding the nerve, was worth the risk of causing the exact damage we were trying to prevent. The textbook answer, at that moment, was to close. Hematomas get reabsorbed. The nerve signal had only dropped slightly. The conservative approach said, finish the surgery, monitor him post-op, give the hematoma time to resolve on its own, and reassess in 48 hours. That was the safe call, the defensible call, the call no medical malpractice attorney could ever challenge. It wasn't the call I made. 23 years in operating rooms teach you things textbooks don't. The rate at which that signal had dropped, the location of the hematoma, the patient's age, something told me 48 hours was too long. That by the time we reassessed, the window would be closed. I told the team we were going to evacuate the hematoma. What followed were the 30 most delicate minutes of that entire surgery. Working in a still bloody field, using suction and irrigation to carefully decompress the tissue around the nerve without touching it directly, millimeter by millimeter, watching the monitor the entire time. The signal dropped further at the 8-minute mark. I stopped, waited, it stabilized, I kept going. At the 19-minute mark, the hematoma had been evacuated. The pressure on the nerve had stopped. We watched the monitor. For about 45 seconds, nothing happened. The signal stayed flat. My resident didn't say anything. Nobody in that room said anything. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the signal began climbing back toward baseline. Mark woke up in the recovery room asking 2 questions. First, how bad was it? Second, whether his wife was still in the building. The answer to the second question was no. The answer to the first was more complicated. Nerve recovery doesn't happen on the operating table. It happens over weeks and months as axons regenerate and signals reestablish themselves. The monitor told us the nerve was alive. It didn't tell us how well it would function when Mark actually tried to stand up. On post-op day 2, he had sensation in his left foot, reduced, like the foot was wrapped in a thick sock, but present. On day 4, he moved the toes on the left side for the first time. Small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He went to inpatient rehab on day 7,